I'm Philippe Malouin. I am a designer. I'm from Canada and I live in London. I have a small design studio and I also teach design at the Royal College of Arts in London. And I guess I'd just start by telling you where I'm from and then where I got to, although it was perfectly summarized prior, so just start. Today I'll talk about a few of my projects. I wish I could talk about all of them, but I will focus on the projects that required a lot of experimentation and sort of process-based design, which I'll go into a little bit further on. I come from just right outside of Montreal, actually, a small city called Valleyfield. It's definitely not the beacon of international design, but it does have a well-known boat race. That's the highlight. After that, I went to University of Montreal Industrial Design program, and it was very, very important to me because I learned the basics. My education started by this curriculum that focused on standard industrial design, learning material resistance, learning all about materials, technical drawings, sort of, yeah, the very basics of industrial design. After a few years, I was lucky enough to have a good sort of average in school, which got me a grant to go study in Paris at the NC Les Ateliers, and I did a student exchange there for 6 months, and that was very eye-opening because it basically showed me a different reality of design, a design that was beyond just a product, and a design that was much more focused on experimentation. That materialized very much by one of my tutors, François Azambour, who is a constant experimenter and a genius of invention. So he was very, very a great source of inspiration for me to eventually decide to stay in Europe and go and do an internship at a studio called Jet, where I was lucky enough to work on a few products and projects for Droog Design. At a very young age, it was a very fantastic opportunity to have. And my boss at the studio, Jet, basically told me, convinced me not to go back to Canada and to further my studies in Eindhoven, Design Academy Eindhoven in the Netherlands, which is sort of a conceptual and experimental academy primarily for design. And I ended up there at the Witte Dame in Eindhoven, where I got a chance to develop sort of a different tangent to the very industrial side of my education I had already received. At the time, the school was led by Lee Edelcourt, who's pictured here, who's an international trend forecaster and also was the art director of the school. And she had a very strong interest in process-based design, which is not the classic linear sketch something and have it produced, but experiment before you decide what it looks like. And I learned a lot from her interests.
There's something so inferior about the way we live, breathing through our mouths and kissing with our lips. I look to the sky, pleading for our God. There's something so superior about the way they live. They don't breathe with their mouths, they don't kiss with their lips. They look down from the sky, and they can't help but sigh. SOS, I send a message of distress out beyond the stars. Can you hear me up on Mars? It's alright if you can't make the flight. You can call me on the phone. I'll send a letter to my home. There's something unfamiliar about the way you dance. You don't pick up your feet.
Basically, this showed how the things worked. One of the parts of my education was that it was very important to document your work as you're doing it and to try to communicate it in a dynamic way as possible. So that's why originally this video was made. At the time when I was graduating, I was very much focusing on reinterpreting the preconceived notions we have about furniture currently, and just to try to reinterpret them in a different manner. And most of these projects, well, at the time, tried to signify just that. Sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. Some items were coagulated together to form hybrids, and that was the beginning of my career. I then graduated and went to work for Tom, who was an amazing mentor. I was very lucky to be offered a position at his design studio, where I was head of custom design items for Tom. And I worked there for about a year and a half until I became busy enough so that I could branch out on my own. This was my first studio, which was also where I used to live, and there was a blend of work and living. As you can see, I had my kitchen on the left and my workshop on the right, so everything was very hands-on, 24/7. Living in North London, well, living in London full stop is extremely expensive, so I had to find a very creative way to make both my practice and my living cohabit, and that's how it was for the first year and a half of the practice going solo all the time. Eventually we got this new studio, which is a lot better suited because it doesn't matter how much dirt and dust and molten plastic I leave around, it won't end up in my bed. So this is where my studio is right now. Process. What I mean by process, like I said before, is a non-linear way to approach design. Here you see a drawing by Achille Castiglione, the design god, whom I'll never ever do anything better than him because he is absolutely a genius. So I had to find a way to have a different source of inspiration in order to generate new concepts. Sometimes this concept generation happened by mixing the properties of certain materials with inappropriate manufacturing techniques, and the next project exemplifies that. I'll show you the paper project which I've done at the Kunsthalle in Vienna. It was a commission originally by the city of Vienna to come and do a design performance over 5 days and produce a body of work only using paper and absolutely nothing else. And that was the big constraint that we had to use. We happened, when we were given that commission, to have a box of receipt paper at the studio that we had left over from designing a shop. And we got really interested in the fact that the paper was thermochromic, which means that it changes color with heat. So the slide that you see on the right-hand side is not actually ink, it's just that the numbers that you see are just burnt into the paper, and then that's how it comes out. So we decided that this source of paper was going to be the main source of experimentation during the week. The beginnings were very humble, and we didn't always find an interesting thing to do with them. But eventually, we decided to mix, like I said earlier on, kind of inappropriate manufacturing techniques. So I was inspired by the way you can throw clay together with your hands in order to form a shape, and mix the rolls of paper with this manufacturing technique, if you like. And we then developed a way of working and shaping these rolls of paper just like you would do with clay, but by rolling them together and then guiding them with my hands up and down. The heat generated from sanding these vessels created the vessels to change color. Same thing happened when you applied a little bit of heat to it. It's important to say that these are not functional items. They were only an experimentation to create a body of work. You can now see the sort of results that we had from this design performance, and it was just it was important to us to just try and create something new that's not necessarily a usable product, but that was just a piece of research. Sometimes mixing industrial processes with craft are also it's a good way of collaborating, because not everything can be made industrially, sometimes hand intervention is very, very important. And I believe that hand intervention has a price, and it has a value, and it should exist in some design items, but it doesn't always need to look like it's craft or that it's handmade. This is the first collection that I had originally done for Next Level Gallery in Paris. It's called Gridlock. Here's a little video that shows the process. A collaboration between the industrial and the computer and the handmade, and both of them existing together can form a different way of working.
Would you really say them? Whispers and tears, that final taste before you're taken away. Odds, ends, final amends. It's alright to say it just as long as you don't really think so. What I'm missing in education, blurring all the hours that you gave to me. It's a wonder I could ever breathe under all the bars. You'll hear the fighting whispers.
The structural lattices are a very basis of most architectural structures, and that's the reason why we wanted to be a part of this building scheme, which transformed us from mere designers into builders of furniture. This project went quite well, and the gallery demanded a second show made of the same. So we multiplied the complexity and worked for even harder in order to make extremely intricate pieces. And these are the results. A big fan of brutalism, being Canadian, being from Montreal, having buildings like Habitat 67 and Place Bonaventure, to then move on to London and be surrounded by a giant amount of brutalist architecture, such as the well, I forgot, but as the Hayward Center, excuse me, so on, we wanted to implement that within our designs, which were both constructivist and brutalist at the same time. Well, that says, oh yeah, form. Okay, process dictates form. The next project was a commission from Kvadrat, the Danish fabric maker, and they asked us to create a special product using only their fabric and anything else we wanted. We were very interested in only using the fabric, and you can see from the following video what happened from our experimentation process. We decided to roll up the fabric in order for it to gain structure, and lining it with a little bit of resin in order for it to become a structural element, using 99% fabric and 0% structural steel beams like most furniture would be comprised of. Most of this experimentation happened on a drum, and when I said that form follows the process, is that the drum was our main source of inspiration. We decided to keep going with it, and that's actually what designed the stool that was created at the end, which was just replicating the side of the drum, and that's the reason why the shape was actually born, just born of our process instead of overthinking how it should look like and be designed. They commissioned us to use their crystals. Well, you know, these are their crystals, and we've never been really used to working with a material like that, and really didn't know what to do. But at the beginning of every process, like I said, we experiment by either smashing them, setting them on fire, try to shoot them across the room, or so on. And eventually we decided to use their very small, the smallest crystals that we could get our hands on, and through experimentation at one point we decided that making them go really fast was a good idea. Many machines went by, and finally one day we had one that was slightly operational and functional. One thing that was important is that the crystals were spinning so fast and our machine wasn't quite rigged together yet that we had to wear protective eyewear, because when the design museum sent a photographer over to document our work, one of the crystals went flying and broke his very expensive camera. Eventually we got the idea to work. There you can see the crystals perfectly catching the light that was directional, with directional LEDs being sort of shot directly at the light, and that's when we knew that our idea could potentially work. We then had to go back to the drawing board and think of a pleasant way to express this idea. Like I said before, form usually comes at the end of my design process and not in the beginning. It's as important as the rest of the design process, but I do believe that it should happen towards the end when you've made experiments and made some kind of a discovery. Then we traditionally decided that these would be light paintings and therefore had to design them. This whole process was a big learning curve, like I said, and putting them together was absolutely harrowing and horrible thing to do, because we had very little time in order to meet the deadline for the Design Museum opening. But eventually we got everything together, all the electronics, all the learning, all the components, and got the machines to work. We worked on the sound after. found the idea of making them move extremely fast a lot more interesting than having them static and having them be purely decorative, but solely exploit their function. Once again, reflection and its color, each individual colors in order to create a different dimension. These are the resulting pictures, and this is the installation at the Design Museum. This is just to show that one part of a project can inspire another, and then you can have permutations that are completely different from one another, but that will create a new way of working. A little while ago, we were commissioned by Lobmeyer in Vienna to create something by using their products, and we made hourglasses using 2 of their glasses and using a studio lathe wood part. This got us to thinking. It got us to thinking on how sand flows by, and we were then commissioned to do a very big installation on this precise concept. Sand is extremely interesting because it falls of its own right and decides where it goes. So we decided to create a special kind of a 3-dimensional hourglass, if you like, that was creating sand patterns and that was showing time passing by. After experimenting in the studio, we eventually found that using motors and well, this is not a very good example, but that shows the very beginning of most of our design process. We use everything we can get our hands on, such as this car rechargeable battery and disco ball motor rotors, in order to put them together. Eventually, this led on to this this installation that was actually built by Lobmeyer themselves in their metal work department, and this installation creates patterns that are generated from changing the 2 motors that we have on top and at the bottom. It's currently on show at the Mack Museum in Vienna. This, well, when I was talking about one project inspiring another, it got us to thinking of sand dunes, because each of the sand particles, when wind is applied or movement is applied, they will each orient themselves and form extremely beautiful and minimal patterns. These patterns are, you know, they can have many sources and variations. We decided that this concept could be pushed forward a little bit. And this is a very first low-tech ghetto 3D printing machine that we made by using a record player and a bucket of sand. We're really interested in the way the sand just oriented itself and formed perfect shapes. Shapes that you couldn't design in a computer, shapes that you couldn't necessarily do with CAD. The sand decided exactly where it was falling down and forming a recipient, a dish. We started experimenting with many other materials, because it's also another very important thing when you're experimenting with a concept or an idea. You should apply it to as many different materials as you can, successfully or unsuccessfully. Tried with wax, tried with a mix of sand and cement, tried with plaster, eventually falling on sugar, sugar being sugar having the capacity to hold itself when it's just applied to a little bit of humidity and heat. Then we went back to the drawing board and decided that it wasn't too interesting to keep using a record player, and we wanted a more professional tool. So we designed a special machine that would make the sugar fall in order to create the form of our dishes. And this shows this machine. as you can see, this was a way of designing a process rather than designing the dish itself. The result was a new collection for 1882, which is a bone china manufacturer in England. And this, what you've seen, is the first plate. I got the pictures today, so I was very happy that it turned out together. And I hope that these few videos and examples showed you a little bit how I work. Thank you very much for coming. Going to Europe, that was very important to me, is the combination of my education here and my European education, which I found extremely beneficial. I guess back in Europe there is funding for, I suppose you could call it, alternative design practices, and it's possible to have a studio and make a living out of it. Whereas I suppose that would be very difficult in my hometown of Montreal to do the same experimental work that I currently do now and getting the same amount of commissions with the same budgets. And I suppose that's one thing I'm able to do these kinds of projects, because there is a demand and there's also an offer for my work to be considered. And the IDS in Toronto is a very good example. They care about my work and they got me here, so I think that both places are extremely important as one another, but I'm just lucky to be there, I guess. But I don't see a giant difference between a European practice and here, perhaps just a different offer and demand.
So you're talking about the difference between practicing design in Europe and here in North America. So what are these differences? What are those differences?
Well, like I was saying, perhaps it's I have the possibility to not take a long time to work on something and to ask ourselves a lot of questions that a lot of people will think completely useless. But I guess the main difference is that there is a lot of infrastructure towards this specific way of working, and I guess that's just the main difference, the infrastructure that's in place from one place to another. But I think that both disciplines are the same everywhere, and at the end of the day it's about solving problems, so it's about how you get to solving the problem that might change, but I don't see a giant difference.
I notice you're working with people. Who are those people? How do you staff your workshop, and how do you collaborate?
It is most importantly a collaboration. I was actually looking for the Polaroid of all of us, because it's not me, it's us, and that's the main important thing. And you have Will Yates, who's my right-hand man, and you have Eva Feldkamp, who's my right-hand woman. And the three of us have been together for quite a long time, and I'm in a position to be able to pay them now, and we also have 2 interns that are helping us, depending on how busy we are and what kind of projects we have. And our sort of setup is that we all experiment in our own different ways, but I usually initiate a concept that's then supplemented and helped out by Will and Eva, and they make discoveries that are also extremely amazing. And it's not without these 2 people and our lovely interns that we'd ever be able to do any work.
I was just wondering, I know you use film to document your actual process. Do you feel as though you've integrated film into your process now? Do you feel as though that helps you with your process, or is that kind of just an after the fact kind of thing, or you just normally just integrate it in and you don't really think about it, or is it?
We normally integrate it all the time, because we don't want to, but it's a good question, because when you go back into it, and it can be part of the process, because when you go back at looking one detail and you've documented it, maybe live when you're busy doing something else, you're going to miss something, but you might go back onto the film and then find a very, very small detail that can then be extrapolated and used to do something completely different. And I think, yeah, it's a good sort of feedback and reverberation that sort of cross-pollinate one another. Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, I suppose it has become part of the process itself.
Do you think your work would be any different if you didn't document with film?
It would be a lot quicker.
Thank you.
Hi. You showed a lot of process on your work. I was just curious if you have any plan, or do you see your studio finally like a commercial use for a lot of what you do in terms of creating commercial products for whatever company? Like, is that the direction you're going, or you plan to simply do process work and discoveries?
I decided to originally give a theme to my talk, and process was the theme of the talk, and that's why I focused on the way I work as process. But we exist in my studio exists in quite a few sort of genres and realms, if you like. We work with art foundations, and we do art installations, and then we do a lot of experimentation, and we do standard product industrial design. But we'd like to not just sketch it out and draw it in a computer. Most of the time, the ideas that we have are just taken from somewhere by doing experimentation. And like the Quadra project is a good example of that. It's an extremely industrializable product, but to start it out, you need to do it in your studio. And extremely interested in working with manufacture and mass production, but that's something we're actually doing right now. So well, hopefully it'll be decent.
The crystal, even the sugar, I believe, in the process. Are you aiming to do something so? What's your inspiration from the source, the infinite small?
I think. Well, the best things come in small packages, I guess, and most of the time it's a very, very small detail that will sort of commence the chain reaction of the creative process, and it's just picking up on one thing that most people don't necessarily spend hours looking at. So by looking at the very small and the very unassuming, you can extrapolate it to potentially create something else, and just paying attention. And yeah, I think the obvious is always very obvious, whereas the small has a lot more wonders to it.